Okay, welcome everybody to now we're down to the last 2 weeks of the spring semester and the last major topic, which I will already tell you right up front. At least one of the slides you're going to see tonight will be on the slide identification and probably one on the slide essay part of the final. Gothic architecture is the topic for tonight, as you can see if you've got your syllabus in front of you, of course. And I even did a little drawing. It's not the greatest artwork in the world, but it's adequate to a diagram to explain the main features of Gothic architecture. We'll get to that in a minute. A couple of announcements. First of all, that the final, I think everybody knows this, right? But if you don't, because I think it was this class last week asked, when is our final? It will be in the evening on the 16th, 16th, I'm okay, 16th week, May 23rd. And the first slide will hit the screen at 6:50, meaning you want to be logged in no later than 6:40 or so. So you have time to, get adjusted and get your notes in front of you and catch your breath. So, some people tend to log in later than that, and that wouldn't be wise on that day. Remember, the final is in real time. It's not being recorded, and it won't be posted on YouTube. So you do have, though, the advantage of more than time and a half. I think some people in almost every one of my classes have a special arrangement for that with the Office of Abilities or whatever disabilities. That is definitely going to be more than time and a half. You'll have until midnight that night to turn it in, just like with the midterm. And we'll review for it next week. But we have a lot to cover between now and then. So the other thing is on extra credit. Let me just double check. But as I recall, nobody has gotten, well, a couple people getting close. Actually, no, I think the most anyone has in this class is 30 points. That's half of the total you could get. So I have now gotten confirmation with one final of the 4 places that I've worked on trying to get us into, as those of you who choose to come to the walking tour. I've gotten confirmation 100% from 3 places, and then I'm waiting for the 4th one. So once I know, that should be by tomorrow, certainly by tomorrow evening, I will email all my classes with the information. But briefly, the tour will be on Sunday, May 26th, May 22nd. I'm fine with my numbers tonight. May 22nd. And it'll be from 2 to 4:30 in Berkeley. There's no issue with parking meters on Sunday. That's why I pick Sundays. There's no sporting events. It will start at one of the most beautiful sites, or certainly historic landmarks in, well, I'd say the whole United States, not just the West Coast. And that's Maybeck's National Historic Landmark is designated church, which, if it sounds like it's just one, it's not. It's a whole group of rooms and spaces. There's the church proper, then there's a Sunday school. Some of Christian Science churches tend to have multiple rooms. Each room has original features, furnishing, light fixtures, beautiful detailing, the materials. It's a remarkable building. It's 1910, and the Sunday school is 1927, I think, and they're connected. So that'll be the first stop. Once I get that 100%, I have to wait for the volunteers to tell me who's going to, because they have to show up. There's not during a church service. We wouldn't do that. They'll have to make a separate trip there to open the building and, of course, walk us through. So point is, it's worth 20 points, extra credit. You don't have to do anything but show up and sign in. I'll have an assistant taking people's names and logging in which class you're in. And there's a $20 fee. I don't get paid to do this. It's been weeks now. I've been working on it. I haven't done one in years because of COVID, but I think this is a particularly, I've done this route before, and it's what some people call South Campus, the area from the university campus itself. We're going to end up on the campus at another Maybeck design building. So we're starting and ending with 2 landmarks, and that's the faculty club. Again, these aren't open to the public normally, so I've arranged for that. And then when you're finished at 4:30, there may or may not be, if I find a place that is historically interesting and not too far away, for an optional potluck, where people can bring, just like any potluck, one item, one dish to, or something store-bought to munch on, and or something to drink. I usually like to end that way, but that's still uncertain. But definitely the tour I'll knock on wood here, just in case something changes, but people will be asked to wear masks inside. I'm sure that would be what most of you would feel is appropriate anyway. Each of the sites and in between, that shouldn't be an issue. And it won't be like 40 or 50 people. That would be, 2/3 of my students this semester showing up, and that's never happened. Probably 15 to 20 people, a nice size group. Okay, you'll get an email with more details, and I would ask you to RSVP. I'll put an email by at least 48 hours for the tour, so I know how people are coming. All right, any urgent questions anybody has? Because I think what we should do is get right into the slides, because my goal tonight, I'll be very honest and upfront with you, is to take a slightly earlier break around 7:45, at least. And during the break, watch, I'm recording it, obviously, some of the game, the Warriors, just 20 minutes worth. I will definitely log back in, in the normal 20-minute time frame. And then we should be able to end a little bit earlier than usual tonight, but we do have a lot to cover. So I will stick around as always afterwards and answer any questions. But right now, is there anybody has any urgent questions about, I do have to do this. This is my way of trying to be proactively, what's the word, motivating or incentivizing. Because it's getting late. So there's still several people that haven't turned a second paper in. In fact, I only got the midterm from some people. I'll just go ahead. Yeah. Walking tours from 2 to 4:30 on Sunday, May 22nd. And I'll give you the address where we're meeting. If you know Berkeley, you may know Dwight and Bowditch, just above Telegraph Avenue. And there's a lot of side streets where parking is, not restricted on Sunday. There's no meters to worry about. I'll give you the information in an email for everybody in the next day or two. All right. So here are the people I didn't get a second paper from: Cara Boughton, Anthony, DeLucci, Emma Hagathorn, Sam Huey, and Matilda Mace. And I guess I won't go into this, but two of those people, I think they know hard, never turn in their first paper. You could still do that, but don't push yourself to the last minute. It's just not a good situation. Yeah. Yes, you can bring someone. The fee would be the same. That they just wouldn't get credit unless they're in an art history class. This has happened, believe it or not, where the teacher recognizes the value of that person attending and decides to give them credit. But I doubt that. It's for everyone in my classes, it's 20 points. For everyone else, it's just the experience. Yes, you can. In fact, I meant to say that. I forgot. Yeah, that'll be in the email. Okay, so, who knows? We may end up with the huge group of 25 people. Yeah, so I will send that out. And then next time I will ask people to RSVP by email, but you could do it at the beginning, not this class, but next week's class, because we'll have less slides to cover than we have tonight. And then also by email. If you don't know till Friday night before the event, that's okay, as long as I know before midnight on Friday. All right. Any questions that are urgent now, like I just saw on the screen, or verbally, that someone feels is urgent enough they need an answer before we start the slides? Anybody? All right, let's get started with our first must know. And Gothic architecture to me is one of the two most interesting. Well, that's hard to say. In the second half of this semester, and let's put it that way, I think it's the most interesting topic because it's still with us. That is, there's still Gothic style buildings being built, and plenty of them in the United States, even though we, as a, quote, urban civilization, unquote, did not have any architecture in the Gothic style during the actual Middle Ages. Right, because that was before the first European colonial interactions with, obviously, that was after 1500. Gothic architecture is the last style of a medieval architecture. You know what? I already forgot. I'm going to do stop the share. I hope this isn't going to cause a problem, because I really do need to hold up this. This is really important. I spent major time doing it last semester. I redid it, in fact, several times to make sure it was. This is something you might want to make note. Well, you should make note of, because It could appear not. You don't have to draw anything or label a diagram, but on the true false section, there definitely will be at least one question relating to these 5 main features of Gothic churches. I'm not going to just list them because you'll see them as we go along through the various slides. We'll get to all of these features within the first half of tonight before we take our break. You'll see each of these items, depending on whether the slides of an interior or exterior of Gothic churches. So it's not just cathedrals, but Gothic churches. And that includes all the American versions, which are like St. Patrick's Cathedral. Some of you know the building. You've been to New York City. It's right on Fifth Avenue, heart of Manhattan. It's in every movie ever filmed about New York. It does anything about Manhattan. There's, all kinds of famous events have occurred there. That's a Gothic Revival church. It's exactly the same style as the ones we're going to see tonight with these 5 features. Okay, let's see. We need to let Jessica in. Okay. Good. You actually didn't miss anything. We were just, let's hope we can go back. Yeah, there we go to the screen share. Now I know I can do that. It's the first time I've done that in a while. In other words, trying to go back and forth without losing the placeholder slide. There we go. All right, everybody can see this, right? The first must know slide.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, thank you guys. Yeah, all right, so here we go. This is Church of Saint Denis. That's Denis, like the French spell it, Denis, only one N. Church of Saint is spelled ST. Remember, that's the French way of abbreviating. Well, actually, any American English, names of saint. You can write the full word out if you choose, but just ST period is fine. Denis, Denis, DNINIS. Ambulatory, that's, I'm sure, a word most of you have never heard. And that is AMBULATORY. Again, Church of Saint or Saint Denis Ambulatory. This is the title. The location, France. The date is 1145. Not cutting this slide from the study list. So it has at least a 50-50 chance of being on the final. Why? Because it is the first, this is an interior, of course, interior detail of the first Gothic church ever built. The Gothic architectural style was invented with this church. In other words, it began with this church. The architect was, when I have, a whiteboard in the classroom, I write it up there, but it's easy enough to write this, was the bishop. I think I've said that, I know I did, with Romanesque churches, but it's just as true with Gothic, that there weren't any professional trained full-time architects in the Middle Ages, or even, well, by the Renaissance, there were some, but during the Middle Ages, it was the bishops of the churches who designed their own buildings with help, of course, sometimes from a local contractor, right? We call them today, but the bishop was really the actual designer. So this church was designed, in other words, the Gothic style for churches was invented by a Bishop Suger. That's Suger, very similar sounding name to sugar, but that's not was his name. Bishop Suger, Suger, obviously he was French. And he invented this style. And after he invented it, it was, you'll see the evidence in the very next slide after this, it was quickly imitated all over France. So obviously that therefore means the Gothic style was invented by French bishops, or this bishop, and then began in France and spread out from there all over Western Europe over the next few decades. So this is the first Gothic church, and it's a walkway. Ambulatory means a curved walkway, and you can barely see the edge of here where my cursor is. That would be the tip of the actual altar. So what is an ambulatory? It's not a definition that stands alone, so you don't have to think you have to remember this for a true false question. That's where you remember, just like with a midterm, any of the terms to know might come up in that section. But for this slide, you might want to write what that means. It's a curved walkway at the rear of a church, doesn't have to be cathedral, the rear of a church, which goes behind the altar. or runs behind the altar. So in other words, a priest can go, or the bishop, whoever's giving the service, can go, behind the altar and then get ready to give their sermon. So again, a curved walkway that runs behind the altar in the back of a church. Well, that's what we're looking at as one side of the ambulatory. Okay, so what makes this Gothic? Well, there are 2 of the 5 elements visible in this slide. Of the 5, I just held up that diagram that you definitely want to take a look at again, but when you review or study for the final. So what do we have? We have the pointed arches. Well, all the arches here are pointed. You see here, that's totally different than the rounded arches that the Romans and then later Romanesque churches we saw last week were using. So it's a new type of archway. It actually is stronger. It supports more weight. So all the doors and windows, this is actually a window. It might look like a doorway, but if you look closely, there's some glass there. And then that's also true of the stained glass windows all the way around the entire walls of the church. All the windows and doors have pointed arches. And then the second feature you can see here is a Gothic groined vaulting, or the use of multiple. Obviously, there's more than one. You can see there's 3 visible, the edge of this one and this, most of that one, and then this one here. So what does that mean? Vaulting means any kind of ceiling that curves upward, of course. But groin in a building, it's related to human bodies. When we say human groin, we mean where things come together, right? So this is where the lines here, these stone, right, reinforcing stonework, intersect at the groin. So again, you don't have to know all that detail. You could just say there's pointed arch Gothic groin vaulting, just for short. Gothic groin vaulting is where the intersects of the support of the stonework on the ceiling intersect each other, and they form a point, as you can see from this right here. So Gothic groin vaulting is stronger than any other kind of ceiling that had been invented before this, and it allows these incredibly tall towers. You're going to see some remarkably tall ones this week. I think we have 1 or 2 to finish up with still next week of churches, Gothic churches. They could get towers as tall as even slightly over 500 feet tall, can be supported by these Gothic groin vaulted ceilings and the pointed arches. And then there's one more feature you won't be able to understand until I show you the next slide, which is flying buttresses, the kind of support on the outside. So just saying all those features put together that I held up in that diagram I drew for you at the beginning of this lecture. If you missed the first few minutes, you want to watch that when it's posted by Friday evening on YouTube. That those 5 features together, you see 2 of them here. I've already covered them. When you put the others total 5 features, you've got the strongest system of support had ever been invented by any architects of any culture. Those towers, 500 feet tall, would not have been possible with the earlier styles of architecture with the rounded arches and no flying buttresses. And if I was in a classroom, which I do for my live classes, I would act out the part of a flying buttress with my body, but we can't do that here. It's not practical. So you'll see them in the slides. Okay, so that's the main part of the meaning here. Let's do a formal analysis. For color, you've got cool gray on the columns and the floors, and then a warm kind of light brown, right? That actually is brick lining the groin vaulting on. So you could just say the ceiling and part of the walls, the stone on at least some of the walls. Those are a warm, almost tan, right? Light brown color or tone. So it's a mixture of cool and warm, but as you could probably see, but if it's not obvious, I'll show you with a close-up. The stained glass windows also have obviously a mixture of blues, reds, oranges, yellows, and green. So there's a mixture of warm and cool colors on the windows too. Hang on. We have the rhythm, all the pointed arches everywhere on the ceiling with the groin vaulting, the pointed arches at the top of the windows, the columns, lots of rhythm. It's dynamic on the ceiling, obviously, there's no straight lines. And on the tops of the windows, but the walls and the sides of the windows are of course stable, and the floor is stable. So it's about equal parts. But actually, when you look at the exterior of a Gothic church, it appears that most of them, because of all the pointed arches and the tall towers, the exteriors seem to be more dynamic. You'll see that in the next slide, than stable. But this is both. And the largest mass, it's very clear it's the ceiling because of all that extra stonework. By the way, these ceilings are not brick. That wouldn't support the weight. Brick is not a stable material. I think we all know that from the 1906 earthquake. It's how it's since going. The building codes after that. You're not allowed to build with brick, right, in California. You can decorate things. So that's just a facade. Underneath that is the stonework. So the ceiling is very heavy. When you add those Gothic groin vaulting and all the extra stone lining and then the brick on top of it's very heavy. So the biggest mass is the ceiling, then the floor. And then I would say it's a close call, but it depends on how you break it up. If you think of this section of wall as between each window, they're very narrow, right? So it's probably by a small percentage of total area covered, maybe the space of the walls, the sides of the walls in between each window, and then the fourth largest would be the columns. Okay, and then we have in space, it's the real curved walkway with about a 15-foot high ceiling. That's not very high. Most churches have much higher ceilings. Well, that's too. I've been in this church. Yeah, that would be where the parishioners sit. The nave, remember the word nave, that will come up on the one way or another on the main aisle. That the ceilings are much taller there, but this is in the back, so the ceilings are only 15 feet high, so it's a real space. There's no techniques for space. Textures: real smooth marble, real rough stone, and real rough brick on the floor, real rough brick on the ceiling, and real smooth glass on the windows. And then we have balance. Well, yeah, it would be symmetrical if you just divide. There's groin vaulting on either side. The columns are, in this photo at least, are right down the middle of this walkway, this aisle here, this ambulatory. So it's balanced, and most Gothic churches are symmetrical from the outside too. So it's balanced. And then we have modeling is just the shadows from the sun. The lines here are both visual. You see them here, of course, on the vaulting. Well, you could say carved because there is carved line just on the top of the columns. So really, it's three kinds of line. And then it should be obvious on stained glass, all of the glass is painted. The lines on the windows are painted lines. Okay, rhythm, mass, balance. I think we covered it all. So let's go to the next must. So again, this one I'm not cutting for the study list. I promise, because I know cathedrals look a lot alike, or churches in general, to most people, and it can get confusing. So I'll cut, at least a couple of the Gothic or of the cathedrals, Gothic or Romanesque, maybe more. But again, we'll do that next week when we do the review a week from Wednesday for the final. Okay, so this is the second must know. Very important, has about a 50-50 chance of being on the final. It's Chartres Cathedral Facade. Chartres is a town in France. Chartres. And cathedral, you all know how to spell. And facade, remember, facade is Indiana. People say F-A-C-A-D, the outside of a building. France, of course, the location. And the date is 1260. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the second oldest Gothic church in the world. That's literally what it is in the first fact, about the meaning you should have in your notes. It's the second oldest. It was designed by the bishop, just like that last one. And no coincidence, this bishop consulted with Bishop Suger. He had heard about this amazing new style of architecture. By the way, Saint Denis is a suburb of Paris. Now it's part of the greater Paris metro area. Back then it was a separate town, out in the countryside, but not far from Paris. So he would have been able to travel easily enough to get there, not that far away. I think it's like 80 miles. And he would have could seen that building being built, or, perhaps even as it was, but these churches took longer than most bishops' lifetime. Very few bishops lived long enough to see the completion of their church. But let's say even half of that church was built Well, that would, and he'd see the blueprints, of course, the plans that the Bishop Suger had drawn up for Saint Denis. So once again, second thing about this is that it was inspired by the first Gothic church, the design for Saint Denis, and that this bishop consulted with that Bishop Suger to get the ideas for how to design the second oldest Gothic church in the world. Now here it has one of the 5 features very visible that was on my diagram that all Gothic, fully Gothic style churches have, and that's a rose window. They're beautiful pieces of hand-painted glass. This one's over 30 feet. I think it's 33 feet. You don't have to know the exact dimensions, but it's over 30 feet. And what is a rose window? It's a large, round, stained glass window in a Gothic church. And they're in every kind of Gothic church, from the smaller ones in the countryside, to these big cathedrals like this one. And even in the ones in the US that are imitations in New York, mostly back east. You don't see too many Gothic. Yeah, there are some out here in California, but not that big. But this one has a unique history, even among Gothic churches, this cathedral. For one thing, you've already noticed, I'm sure, the 2 towers aren't identical. They're not the same height, let alone the same width or the same degree of decoration. That's important. They are not equally decorated, nor are they equal in height or unequal in height, and they're unequal in width. Even the thickness of the walls is greater on this tower, the one on the right in this photo, than on this one. So let me see. Well, this is, no absolute right or wrong here, but just curious if anyone can guess or has a guess, educated guess, whatever, about which of these 2 towers was later. I'll go ahead and tell you this, that the tower, one of these 2 towers was built 2 centuries later. And in other words, when the church opened, one of the 2 towers was complete and the other one was just wasn't there. It would have ended one of these 2 right along where my arrow or cursor, I'm sorry, is drawing a line. So can anybody guess, based on the thickness of the walls of this one and the height, it's about 30 feet shorter than the taller tower, and the less ornament on this one and the greater ornament here, which of those 2 towers might be later? The later one that was added 2 centuries. Anybody? Just
The second one that's more decorated.
yes, exactly. A good way of putting it. Everybody hear that? So here's the thing, that you don't have to remember this, but just for those like on our walking tour, you may see some evidence is that the later buildings are in a given style, right, or period of architecture, the more ornate they are. That just, it's all over the world. It's not just, Europe and North America, Western art. It's just a human tendency to, want to, my dad would say, gussy up a building or whatever the purpose was. Absolutely. The one with a greater ornament, plus it's taller. And remember, this is still only the second Gothic church, and you might just guess, and if you want to add this, you could, about the meaning. One more fact here. We have several more, but another fact you might want to have in your notes is that when these churches were first built, they were still pretty experimental. In other words, the architects, the bishops, weren't certain that they wouldn't collapse. I mean, these towers are taller and heavier than any church towers had ever been. So this bishop who designed this was being more cautious. I don't want to say conservative, but you could say that, but cautious, so that his tower is thicker, the walls, so he knows that they have strong exterior wall, right, strength, and the tower isn't as heavy, because it's not as tall. And it's less ornate. Yeah, so the ornament is that is, you said very well, that is usually the easiest way to tell the difference between when a building is. I'll give you one quick aside, definitely don't need to write this, but from, I don't know how many of you live in Petaluma or in the city, near the old towns of Petaluma or Santa Rosa, or have been to San Francisco, where you see Victorians all over the place. But the older the Victorian era houses are, like right after the gold rush, the simpler they are, the less ornate. And the later they are, when you get to the 1890s, you've got these massive wooden, creations, what some people call gingerbread. I hate that term, but carved and plaster ornaments, both wood and plaster, painted up with they call them painted ladies. So those are all from the same era, Victorian architecture from the 1840s through the 1890s. But the later you are in that era, the more ornate Victorian era building would be. So it's the same thing with Gothic churches. Okay, back to main points about the meaning here. Now, let me show you a little bit closer view. You see one of the other features. This is the most important feature, I would say, structurally, the most important feature of the five main features of Gothic churches. Flying buttresses. And that is not the name of a family of acrobats that used to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. Actually, no, you know what I'm talking about. That's with the Beatles did their first performance. Anyway, the first live TV variety show. So these are stone. I call them stone arms. They're, you could say arms of stone. They project out from the wall several feet. And you might think, so what? Who cares? What's the big deal? Well, that's what makes it possible to have these 300, 400, and 500 feet tall towers. By the way, these towers, one's about 280 and the other's about 300, a little over 300, if you're curious. I'll repeat that when we do the formal analysis in just a couple minutes. But the flying buttresses, even though you only see the edge of one of them, if you were to walk around the building, you'll see in my own slides of the most famous Gothic church in the world, in Paris, of course, the one that almost burned, right, in Notre Dame. That's the next building we're going to look at. But these flying buttresses on all Gothic churches are essential. They help support the weight of the walls and towers above them. I like to think of them as, like I said, I'd act this out if I could for you, but that doesn't work on a Zoom class. Is to put a row of giant, very strong giant creatures, whatever they are, with their arms extended, or stretched. There we go, out and touching the wall here. And then that's where the weight of the building, the pressure, it's called stress. You don't have to know that word, but architects call it stress in a building, right? Is always the weight from gravity pushing down and out, just like you would imagine it would without having to get too technical. The weight of the building would make it collapse if it weren't for these flying buttresses. So the pointed arch windows help some because they deflect some of that weight, but it has to go somewhere. So it goes out into the flying buttresses and into the ground. The actual stress that the building is, constantly subjected to by the force of gravity. So I'll summarize that in the plain English but these are like arms, like giant stone arms, these flying buttresses. They line the outer walls of all Gothic style churches every few feet, all the way around. You'll see them with my slides of Notre Dame, all the way around one side, down around the back, and up the other side. You can only see this side because it's from an angle, obviously, where the photo was taken. So the flying buttresses are basically the main feature of this new style that made it even possible to have these immense towers. Okay, and the last thing about the meaning is, if you look closely, some of you may notice these are not pointed arch windows. They're rounded. So they are Romanesque. Why are they on a Gothic church? Well, last fact on the meaning is that this church replaced an earlier Romanesque style one that burned, but the front section of the walls still stood. So this bishop decided to incorporate just those 3 windows and that section of the old church wall into the new building, which happened a lot when you had an older building and it burned partly. And then these are new. These are obviously the pointed arches and the doorways are Gothic style, as are all the other windows, all the way up the towers. Okay, so by the way, if you're curious to know, when the church opened, and this was just this side on the left, there was nothing above it. This tower wasn't finished until 1516. You don't have to know that year. It's more detailed than you need to know, but that, if you do the math, is over 250 years after this tower was completed. The church opened, in other words, with this tower completed and no tower on the left. And 250 years, 2.5 centuries later, they finally added the other tower. I guess they ran out of money. I don't know the reason why that happened. It was designed to have 2 towers originally. Okay. The stained glass. It's pretty obvious, but why don't we wait? We'll do that with the next slide. I'll show you the interior and you'll see some of the stained glass. They're considered the most beautiful stained glass windows in the world by some historians. Personally, I prefer the one in Paris, but they're certainly some of the most beautiful stained glass windows ever created. in this church. And that's something that you wouldn't see anywhere near as much of. There were stained glass windows in the Romanesque style, earlier medieval era churches, but they weren't this big. And they didn't have these giant 30+ foot wide rose windows. Okay, formal analysis. Is it balanced? Well, you could decide on this one and totally leave it up to you. I mean, because this tower is shorter and thicker, heavier, right? But this tower is taller. So clearly it isn't balanced, but which side is it unbalanced toward? That is a matter of personal interpretation. To me, it seems unbalanced toward the right because these walls are so thick and the whole tower is so much wider that to me, this is the heavier. So if you break it down to mass, I would say the biggest mass is the tower on the right, then the tower on the left, and then the central section or middle portion of the facade. Just this one view here. And then the rhythm is obvious with the pointed arches. You can't see other flying buttresses. Maybe just a little tip of one of them right there. It's the second one barely visible. But anyway, there's rhythm on the flying buttresses. On the 3 doors, it's called the tri-portal. I'll explain what that means with the next building. But for now, you can just say that rhythm is repeated shapes of all the doors and windows and pointed out. Well, except these 3 Romanesque ones. And there's obviously rhythm on the rose window. The stonework is supposed to look like a giant rose blossoming, I guess. And then we have, which is it stable or dynamic? Well, with most churches, it's both, but it feels to me more dynamic because the tall, that's the final feature of what makes it a building Gothic style. Tall tapering spires. There are 2 of them. That's dynamic. All the pointed arch doors and windows, the rose windows, that's all dynamic, the 3 doors. But of course, there are stable elements at the corners on the walls. The color is actually a light yellow, so it's a warm color. It's an unusual color of stone. Only a certain part of France where they can get that. So the stone is warm, but it's cool on the tile, or it's actually slate if you want to get technical. It's a kind of tile, a gray color on the 2 spires. You can't see the colors in the windows. You don't have to worry about that. Then is it? For space, well, let's do the space. The 2 towers are, one is about 280 feet, the shorter one, and the other one's a little over 300. I can't remember if it's 305 or 310, but you could just say one. You could even be very simple and say the 2 towers are one. The shorter tower is a little under 300 feet, and the taller one's a little over. But you need to also add interior space under the real space with the building. The nave is about 120 feet tall. No, actually, it's more than that. About 130 feet. Yeah, that's right. About 130 feet tall. The ceiling inside. You can see it in the next slide. Okay, and then we have already mentioned mass, right? Let's see. Oh, modeling is just the shadows from the sun. And the line is both carved and visual, but you can't really see carved line much here. So you could just say it all appears to be visual lines. Of course, which is where the modeling for the sun shows the edges of the arches on the doors and windows. And of course, in the decoration on this tower. And it doesn't show much on the corners because of the angle of the time of the day. It's probably taken around noon. Okay, let's see. Texture. Yes, sorry, almost forgot. Texture here is the real rough texture of stone and the real smooth texture, of glass. There's no cement texture visible here. Okay, the next slide is the interior of the one we just saw. Okay, so this is the nave of Chartres Cathedral. Again, Chartres, right? And it's that Chartres, nave of Chartres Cathedral, France. I already defined what a nave is. Remember last week, you definitely will come up in one of the slide essay questions. And again, the date is 1260. Well, it would be because that's when the church opened. That's when it was completed, except for the tower on the left, the taller later tower. Every other part of it was ready for the public to come in and worship, of course, church service at church services. Now, obviously, we've covered this in the last couple of or several slides, I think 2 or 3. These are not the original seating here. There was no seating. You provided your own unless you were wealthy, and then there probably were some kind of heavy wooden pews. I guess they took them out here because I've seen them in some churches. Carved wooden pews for the wealthy, for the, well, for nobility, right? Which is typical, right? They got special treatment. Everybody else would have brought their own seating, but now, of course, these are modern folding chairs. But what you want to focus on is the features that mark it as Gothic style. Remember what a nave is, the long central aisle of a Christian church where the worshipers sit. By the way, they're all facing the altar, and the photographer, if it's not obvious, was standing right in front of the altar when he or she took this photo. Then we have the rose window, right? See right there how lovely it is. Of course, you can't see the colors in it because the way the lighting is. Your Gothic groin vaulting that we saw with the first slide on the ceiling, right, where they intersect here. And then the pointed arches on all the windows, except these, you see two of the three that are left over from the Romanesque church, but all the other windows have pointed arches. The flying buttresses, you saw the edge of one section of them, but they'd be at wherever this group of columns is, the thicker sections in between the windows, every second set of windows or every other set, is where the flying buttress would attach on the outside. And that's why this is really the most important fact about this slide and all Gothic architecture it's true of, that only with Gothic style can you get walls of windows. Literally, those walls are about 3/4 glass. That wouldn't support any weight of 300-foot tall tower. Of course, it would be disaster that would collapse in on everyone below and kill probably everybody inside the church. So how do they do that? Because of the flying buttresses. The flying buttresses, which attach, right, looks like about every 10 or 15 feet, allow for the upper walls to be literally, there's no other way to say it, walls of windows, or if you prefer, walls of glass. It's unique to Gothic architecture, that concept and that freedom to allow more. And therefore, of course, they can get very fancy and ornate with their stained glass patterns and painted details on these windows. You can see the colors here, and if you didn't write it before, you probably should. These are what most historians consider, or just not most, many historians consider these the most beautiful stained glass windows in the world because of the deep, rich, saturated colors. Those are what I've read in many texts. Now, I've been in this church twice, and I love it a lot. It's beautiful, but I still prefer the windows in Notre Dame. You'll see those up close. And one of the must-know slides is the rose window at Notre Dame. Okay, so the stained glass here is quite beautiful, but the walls here don't have as much glass to stonework because the flying buttresses up above, of course, are joined here, and then so everything above the flying buttresses can have that, and then you add that with the groin vaulting, and then of course the columns also help support the weight of everything above them, all put together with the pointed arches themselves on the actual windows framing. It makes it the strongest system of architecture ever developed up until skyscrapers of the late 19th century, the earliest skyscrapers in the late 1800s. Up until the invention of that new technology, this was the strongest and therefore the tallest form of architecture in the world, Gothic churches. All right, formal analysis. Is it balanced? I think it's pretty clear that it is symmetrical. If it's not obvious, just write it that way. They're identical, these churches, interiors especially, on both sides, because that's an aisle, right, a side aisle where people can walk them and get to their seats. There'd be one just exactly the same, everything identical on the left side of the nave. So it's totally symmetrical. But when it comes to mass, it's a matter of interpretation. You see the floor goes all the way out towards the outer wall, so it's wider. So I could see where, and I leave it up to you, you might think of the floor, if it's on the essay part of the final, as the largest mass, and then the ceiling. But there's so much stonework, and that's so heavy, that ceiling. I'd say it's almost equal, but probably the floor being wider, you could say it appears to be the larger mass. Second largest, therefore, would be the ceiling. And the third largest in this photo would be the lower row of arches, right? Remember, arches go all the way to the ground here. So that would be these rather large segmented arches here. So a row of arches. So I'd call that the third largest mass. And then we have for color, it's actually cool gray stone on the inside. You can see if you look closely here. Now the sun is hitting this, so it might make the ceiling look, and it may even have been painted or plastered, I meant to say, not painted, later on. But originally the ceilings were this cool gray stone color, whereas the exterior is the warm yellow stone that we talked about. So I know it looks like it's a mixture of warm and cool, and if you wrote that, I wouldn't take points off, but actually all of the stonework inside is cool gray. But there's warm colors mixed with cool, of course, on the stained glass windows. The textures are real rough stone everywhere you see the stone, right? And then real smooth glass on the windows. So real stone on the ceiling, rough textures on the ceiling, the arches and the floors, smooth on the windows. Then we have, it's dynamic, obviously, on the Gothic groin vaulting on the ceiling, on the pointed arch windows, the rose window, of course, and then stable on the columns, the floor, and the walls, the outer walls. The line here is both painted, right, on the stained glass, and visual. You don't really see any carved line here. The edges of these groin vaults have that same, right, visual line. The modeling is just the shadows from the sun. And let's see, did we say, yeah, it is balanced, right? Well, I don't know if I said that left to right. Yeah, I did. It's symmetrical, both directions. Now, is it balanced top to bottom? There, I would say it's weighted toward the bottom because the floor is wider than the ceiling. Okay, I think we covered everything. Now, this next slide is, again, very, along with the very first slide, if I had to pick which slides are the most likely to appear on the exam for you to spend carefully taking good notes now and having them next to you during the exam and, whatever, reviewing them, I would say the very first slide of the ambulatory at Saint-Denis and this one are the two in the first half of tonight's lecture that have, they're not, I'm not cutting this slide for sure from the study list. So this one, our next must know, is Notre Dame Cathedral. Should look familiar to some of you. It's so famous. It's one of the most famous buildings in the world. It's certainly probably the most famous Christian church in the world, right? Notre Dame Cathedral. It's French for Our Lady. 2 words, well, 3, including cathedral. Notre Dame is first word N-O-T-R-E, and then Dame, or D-A-M-E, Cathedral. Paris location. The date is 1250. So this was the third, or is, sorry, still is the third oldest Gothic church in the world. It was begun after Chartres and the other one were completed. And it is the cathedral of Paris. It has been since it opened. And that is nearly 700 years ago, isn't it? Yeah. So this is considered, and this is one of the main reasons why it's so important, why it has a high possibility of being, or probability of being on the final, and it's considered one of the most important buildings in the world because it's the prototype, or you could say another way, a classic example of French Gothic, a style of architecture that's imitated all over the Western world. Actually, I've seen churches like this in China and Vietnam. Well, of course, Vietnam was a French colony, as you may know, for over 150 years. And China had missionaries, whether they were asked to come or not, they came on the coast of China. And I've seen Gothic, French style Gothic churches in Asia too. So it's not just in Europe and North America. It's a classic example of the French Gothic style, which is what? Symmetrical, completely symmetrical facades, and very, very controlled, you could say controlled, or very carefully placed is a better way to say it, carefully placed ornaments. Because you notice, let's go back a second to see how much how ornate that is. It's getting, well, after all, it's almost near the end. It is practically the end of the Gothic style. But this is not as ornate. It's still plenty decorative, but it isn't just covered encrusted in ornament, right? And then it has the triportals, which all Gothic cathedrals had, and they have a meaning as part of the notes on the meaning. You should have the three portals on a Gothic style church, especially a cathedral, but not only cathedrals. It symbolizes the three holiest figures to what was then, of course, there were no Protestants, right? The Catholic Church. The three holiest figures of the Catholic Church, not the Pope, would be God, his Son. They don't have any specific meaning, just the three together mean the three holiest figures are in the Catholic religious belief is God, his Son Jesus, and the Holy Ghost, supposedly a spirit or angel that passes back down from heaven back down to earth, delivers messages to people on earth. It's called the Holy Ghost. So God, again, the Holy Trinity. Some of you know that phrase, and in Espanol is Trinidad, right? There are a lot of cities named Trinidad. That's what they mean. Almost every Latin American country has a Trinidad, Cuba, and Mexico, and a bunch of cities in the U.S. too, where there's a high Spanish-speaking Catholic population. So the Trinidad, or Holy Trinity, it's the way you should write it, literally means the three doorways on a Catholic church. They're not to be Gothic, but usually they are symbolic again of the three holiest figures for Catholics, which are the Father, God, the Father, his Son, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost. Okay. All right. Then we have these statues. That's another typical feature of many French Gothic, or most French Gothic churches. These symbolize figures from the Bible, but they have a dual meaning. They also symbolize the kings, earlier kings and queens of France, mostly kings. In fact, I think they're all kings here. And they could be, well, actually, there's a right, a queen. So those figures have a dual meaning above the doorway there. In French Gothic architecture, they both are meant to evoke, or remind the worshipers as they walk into the church about figures in the Bible that they're going to study, or they should know, or they're going to hear in the names of inside. Then the other meaning is a more political meaning. They also would be reminding them of their own past rulers, kings and queens of France prior to this building. Then we have the rose window here. By the way, you're going to see one of the slides, and I will see it after the break, is a massive rose window. This church has the largest rose windows in the world. This one is not the largest. This one is about a mere 35 feet across. On the sides of the church, you'll see with my next few slides, are the two biggest rose windows on earth ever created, and they're 40 feet wide. Remarkably big piece of stained glass. Remember, this is part of the meaning you could add. This is the one that had that horrible fire and nearly destroyed the church. It's just I'd call it more than a minor miracle. I'm not getting religious. I'm just saying it is just by luck and chance and hard work all together that this church was saved. Otherwise, if that fire got another half hour, even 45 minutes, it would have collapsed. And this church is on the UNESCO, in case it's not obvious, World Heritage list, and it's considered to be one of the most beautiful churches in the world by people in every survey ever taken. But now I'm going to do a little brain teaser here, since we had a very interesting response when I asked you about which of the two tall towers. I mean, at Sharp might have been the later one, and that was the correct response. Let's see if anyone can tell. There is something, I'll give you a clue, different about these two towers. And it's not in the decoration. It's not the height. They're both 240 feet high, but there's something, I'll give you a clue, different between these two towers. Look closely. It's not obvious at first glance. It's not meant to be. It's meant to kind of, I call it a brain teaser, whatever you want to call it, a visual trick. Anybody guess what I'm talking about here?
One's thinner than the other.
Say it again. I think you said it. Yeah.
One's thinner than the other.
Yeah. Basically, you got it. Excellent. This tower is about 2 feet narrower than this one. This tower is 2 feet wider than however you want to say it. And why did the bishop do that? Well, we don't know. I think he was just having fun, playing a game, visual, a trick on parishioners. And then there's another I think it's more obvious difference between these doors. One of the doors is something different from the other two. You notice, probably most of you already noticed, right? Notice something different about one of these?
Like the
Yeah.
thing on the top of the door?
Yeah, the extra point above the door on the far left. Added for what reason? No one can say. It's just the bishop who designed this church was I think he was trying to have a little fun here. You could just say he's playing a visual trick on anybody else. By the way, if you're curious, this is my own slide. It was taken in the winter. The scaffolding is not holding the church up. It's there to clean it, because Paris is, as much as they're into pollution control, they're really big on global warming measures and things. You may know that. And they're trying to get renewable energy more and more all the time. But nonetheless, there's a whole lot of cars and trucks and buses. There's a lot of traffic in Paris. It's a metropolitan area is about the same size as Greater Chicago, about 10 million people. That's a big city. So the pollution just constantly, discolors the stonework. So they have to keep cleaning it. They never actually finish. I mean, they clean from one top. I think it's obviously here they started, at the top and worked down. So if you're curious, you don't have to write, that's not part of the meeting, but if you're curious what's that scaffolding doing, they were cleaning it. And this was right around Christmas time, so they stopped for a few days. Okay, so let's do our formal analysis, and then what I'll do is show you, we'll see, I might do one more must know. I want to take a break around 7:40-ish. We might do one more must know. Let's see how many we got. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, let's just do the formal analysis, and then I think you'll find that next 7 or 8 slides you want to take notes on, unless you want to, because they're all of this church from different angles, interior and exterior, and some rather remarkable and beautiful details. But we'll do that in the next few minutes after the formal analysis. So let's do that. It is a cool off-white color. This may look gray, but it's actually this color, of course, the real color of the stone. The textures are the real rough texture of the stonework and a real smooth texture of the glass, of course. Remember what makes this a Gothic style church. The flying buttresses you don't see in this slide, because I took it I wanted a close-up view of this, a tight, framing when I took it. So I was planning to use it for this very class. It was many, many years ago. I was already teaching a course at the JC then. It was like 98 or something. So you don't see the flying buttresses, but of course they are there. That's one of the things that makes it Gothic. Then we have the rose window, right? We have the pointed, all the doors and windows are Gothic, pointed arches here. Inside, we'll see the interior is the Gothic groined vaulting, but the spire is on the back. There it is, the tall tapering spire. It was added centuries later, but it was designed to have that spire. They just didn't finish that. That's true of a lot of Gothic churches. We'll talk about those details, and you can just look and listen and not have to write after the formal analysis is done with this one. So in other words, this was one of those classic examples that has all the 5 elements of Gothic architecture, but of course on the exterior you can only see 4 of those, not the ceiling, obviously. And so you wouldn't, from this photo, maybe realize it does have the tall tapering spire. It's just on the back end of the roof there, instead of between these 2 towers or above them. All right, so then we have the obvious, we already mentioned the rhythm. What makes it stable? The edges, the overall corners of the building, right? But otherwise it's almost entirely, well, the squared shape of the towers too, that's stable. But all the doors and windows, obviously, pointed arches, giant portals, and of course the stained glass window, that's all dynamic. The modeling is just, here it was an overcast day, so rather obviously foggy. It actually gets foggy in Paris, sometimes quite foggy, almost as much as London. So there wasn't any shadows, but there would just be the normal, right, natural, I meant to say natural shadows created by the sun. There's no technique for modeling. Here you can see the line is both carved around the doorways, especially, and on the statues above the doors, and visual at the edges around the corners here. Now, for space, we have 2 towers that are 240 feet tall, and the nave is 140 feet. So it's sort of a medium height. There are naves taller. There's a couple that are, we'll see, I think tonight, or maybe it's early next week when we finish with the last Gothic church slides. There are naves in Europe that are 180 feet tall, the ceiling. This one is sort of in between. It's not one of the shorter or tall. It's 140 feet. So the real space again of the ceiling is 140 feet. The 2 towers are 240. But when it comes to balance, now you know the fact, but if it isn't obvious, you need to write this. It is unbalanced actually towards the left because this tower is 2 feet wider, therefore clearly heavier, even though it's the same height. So the largest mass is the tower. Remember that towers are considered from the ground up all the way to the top. That would be the largest mass on the left, the tower on the right, second largest, and then the central section or middle portion of the facade is the third largest mass. Let's see, texture, line, color, you already mentioned that. Balance, rhythm. Am I forgetting anything? I'm trying to remember if I've got, yeah, I think I've got it all. Texture, line. Okay, so now you can just rest your pens. And or your fingers and just listen and look. This is the back end of Notre Dame. This would be the ambulatory. You're going to see it from the inside in the next few slides. These are just my own slides. I took that same visit. And here are your flying buttresses. The arms of stone is how I like to call them. You can see how that would be a metaphor, I think is an appropriate one. I don't think anyone else has ever, no textbooks ever said that, but they almost are like giant arms of some huge, gigantic creature that's super strong and is holding up the weight of that really heavy, because that's metal. By the way, all of the metal here, again, you'll have to know this, but it was all lead and it melted, including the tower, the spire, I meant to say the spire. The spire just collapsed. And so they're replacing each of those the way they originally were. They said 5 years. Nah, that was 3 years ago. I don't think they'll reopen it in 2 more years. Probably take 10. But they will restore it the way it was before. Anyway, so this is all of the flying buttresses allow this, the massive weight of the roof. This is rather heavy, or it was and will be again, right? The tall tapering spire, which is made of metal. Then the rest of the church, the flying buttresses go all the way around the side. And you'll see them in another view here. But this is what I meant about a wall of windows. Look at that, how much glass. In fact, this might be more like 80% glass on the upper parts of the walls because of the flying buttresses that carries the weight, the stress, architects call it, or pressure, if you prefer the word pressure, from everything above, the ceiling, the roof, the spire, and the upper parts of the walls. That all creates very heavy pressure, or forces of gravity. And that's carried down into literally the ground below, because the flying buttresses, of course, go all the way to the ground. And that's what allows the walls of window that I've been talking about. Okay, so let's go to another view here. There are plenty of people, I think, who would agree with this. It doesn't matter that you don't need to know or say, but this church has been the inspiration for almost every other Gothic style, at least, influenced by French Gothic style architecture around the world. There is one in San Francisco, by the way, extra credit option is a tip. You don't have to write this unless you don't know about it. It's Grace Cathedral on Nob Hill in the heart of San Francisco. That is a replica of this, nowhere near as complete and as detailed, but it's quite beautiful. And it's directly, the architect had gone to Paris and maybe even studied there. I think it was the bishop then too. And that church was built about 100 years ago in the 1920s. Here's your 40-foot wide rose windows. It's incredibly massive stained glass windows, the largest rose windows in the world. There's one on each side. And remember, that's the nave, of course, the long, narrow aisle. The side aisles are called the transept, not side aisles, the intersecting aisles. Transept, where the rose windows would be at the end of each. And there's the row of stone arms, however you want to call them, but the flying buttresses that help support the weight of everything above them. It's amazing they didn't collapse. I mean, parts of the ceiling did, and the spire, but the stained glass, all of the stained glass survived intact. And these massive towers, luckily they weren't damaged. The fire didn't get to the front of the church. But in case you wonder, I was about to say why certain people, one of the most famous is Ernest Hemingway. He lived in Paris and wrote his first few novels there, as you may know. Actually, I think he raised his first 2 kids there. He said something to, actually it's a direct quote, all good Americans get to go to Paris when they die. I happen to agree. It's the most beautiful city in the world. Big city, okay, large city. It just, the combination of the intact architecture, the public spaces, the wide open green areas. This is in December, remember, so these trees would be in full bloom, of course, in the spring. And then the buildings of even just the average apartment buildings are aesthetically pleasing because they don't have a lot of jangled or jagged, I call them jagged edges on them, and discordant heights, materials, colors. There's a combination of some kind of cohesive design. It's conscious, deliberate. The city government of Paris is maintained. No skyscrapers in the city limits. There are skyscrapers in Greater Paris, all in several different sections in the suburbs outside the city limits, but they maintain the beauty of the historical neighborhoods very diligently, and I think it shows. If you ever go there, you can see for yourself. All right, let's go inside. Here's the nave, 140-foot tall nave. Look at the stain. There's your groin vaulting, and there's your stained glass windows. I had to take this with a handheld camera. No tripods are allowed and no flash. And yes, it was a 35mm camera. There weren't any digital cameras. I took these slides probably back in well, no, it wasn't the 90s. Yeah, I guess digital cameras were just starting. There's your beautiful colors. I think these are the most beautiful windows I know of here, set into the ambulatory. There's the altar and the walkway right behind it. We started tonight's lectures with from the first Gothic church. It's the same concept. Very massive walls, of course, but even so, the upper portions are walls of windows. And then we'll go right up to the break with this view. So this is not, you don't have to write this. I put it on some of my other classes, but not on this one. Let me double check. No, it isn't. It's a statue of Mary, if it's not obvious, and baby Jesus. And this is the most amazing thing about it. It looks like a natural portrait of a real mother with a baby, and a baby that doesn't look like a miniature 30-year-old man with a bad haircut, like so many paintings of Jesus and baby Jesus and Mother Mary do. Plus, she's freestanding, or is she? Actually, her elbow touches the wall. Okay, but it's almost freestanding, and that didn't happen again until the Renaissance. You might recall when we talked about, you have to remember, there's a course from before the midterm, contrapposto, and statues that were freestanding were a Greek invention. They weren't supported by anything around them. This comes very close, and it's 200 years before the Renaissance rediscovered that pose. And the other amazing thing is she looks Asian, and it's not my opinion. That is what Chinese Christian groups have called it, nicknamed it, dubbed this statue the Chinese Madonna. I heard them say that when I was in this church from Taiwan, the island that's not under communist control of let's hope they don't do, the Chinese communist government doesn't do to that island what Putin's been trying to do to Ukraine. Anyway, they have particularly a large portion of their population, I don't know what percentage, happen to be Christian. And my next door neighbor is from that island. And they happen to go to church regularly, and they're usually Catholic. So they come here on tours, and I saw a tour bus from Taiwanese, halfway around the world, get out and literally were in tears looking up at this because they'd studied it back at home, I'm sure, probably in the church or maybe in school. It's a uniquely distinct image, a beautiful image of a mother and a very delicate, loving pose with her own baby on her shoulder here. It looks like he's about to kiss it, right? So it's a really beautiful piece of sculpture, and it was saved. It was moved out of the church before the rest of the ceiling all around it collapsed during that fire. But somebody thought to somehow, I don't know how they did it, detach it from the column and took it out. So it's in safe storage now. So when they reopen the church, this will be put back in place. But they didn't need to do that with the stained glass. Luckily, all of those windows, they couldn't have removed them, of course, survived intact. So, okay, we're looking at, let's see, how many more slides we're looking at. We're just about exactly halfway. So we still should be able to end early. Why don't we take, let's say, a 20-minute break? And it is almost 7:42. So we'll come back at 8:02. All right. I'll see you then. Yeah. 20 minutes. Okay. All right. So where's that doing? Too good lately. But anyway, we got several more slides, but we're still going to end several minutes early. But at the moment, again, as always, even though I may not say that all of the remaining slides are so important, I won't cut them. I always tell you when that comes up, just assume any of these might be on the exam. Okay, this is the next must know. Prophets and ancestors of Christ. Prophets is You probably remember it's not the thing you make if you're lucky on the stock market. It's the other kind of profit. PROPHETS, Prophets and Ancestors of Christ is the title. Location, it's the same as, spelling as the church we started, or second church we looked at. Chart, CHARTRES is the location. The date is 1155. So what we're looking at here is a group of gem, and that's the right word. I used that word last week when we talked about Romanesque sculpture and the doorway, framing of the doorway. Any statues, of course, it's a door jamb. So any statues that line the door jamb are by definition jamb statues, right? JAMB, of course, not the other kind of jamb. So these are slightly larger than life, but you can see they're about life size, like a tall person would have been. The height of the average human being is increased, male, female, Western, Eastern, whatever, doesn't matter what continent. On average, there is a genetic tendency towards slightly taller people. And, from one century to the next doesn't happen, automatically every generation, but over time. So these are about 6 feet tall, and they line the edges of the doorways, the jambs, and they are, just as the title tells us, but that's not the only part of the meaning. But the religious meaning of these statues, all Gothic cathedrals and many Romanesque, even, you can just say medieval cathedrals had this kind of statuary. These are figures from the Bible, from the Old Testament. That's an important detail. When we say prophets and ancestors, they mean ones that came before Jesus. And of course, as you may know, you don't have to know this for the exam, but the second half of the Bible is the part from after Jesus was born, and that from there forward. So this is from the earlier part, the Old Testament, before Jesus was born. And these are figures from the Bible, from the early part of the Bible. So they are mentioned in the Bible. They're holy figures. They have halos, and that's their religious meaning. It doesn't matter which figures from the Bible they are. I'm not even sure myself, but they are all figures that people supposedly would recognize, or if not, they'd be told which ones they are by the priests or bishop, if it was a bishop conducting the church services during the worship service. The other meaning, though, is equally important. I kind of touched on it before the break with the facade of Notre Dame in the row of statues above the 3 doors here. So these statues also have a political meaning, which is that they have a dual identity. And the other identity, besides a religious biblical identity, is earlier kings and queens of France. In fact, there is, some of you may have heard of it, a novel, was a best-selling novel, I think, in the last 50 years, if not maybe ever, but something like 30 million copies, The Da Vinci Code. They even made a movie of it with Tom Hanks, was a very well-made movie. The book was interesting, but it was full of baloney about supposedly Jesus having a secret wife and a child, and that's the origin of the French monarchy. Well, there are people in France that tried to peddle that theory during the Middle Ages to convince people that they should just obey blindly their own rulers, particularly the king and his family, kings and queens, the royalty, because they somehow could say they were connected to the early Christian figures of Jesus and ones that came right after that. There's no evidence. In fact, that's absolutely zero evidence for that. It's just one political line, you might say, propaganda. Okay, so these figures had that dual purpose, and they would be symbolic of the fact that you, as a worshiper going into church, were supposed to look up at these figures and not only admire them and respect them because they were from figures in the Bible, but that they also represented some of the earlier rulers of your own kingdom, of your country, of France. So that's the dual purposes. Okay, and then we have the fact that they're on one of the 3 doors. Remember what that was? The tri-portal is the phrase for 3 doors. Always in a Catholic cathedral, that there were 3 doorways which represented the 3 holiest figures. We already covered that, right? God, in the Catholic Church, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. So these are lining one of those 3 doors. Okay, and also it's on Chart, and you already know about Chart. Chart is the second oldest Gothic church. So these statues were finished before the church was open. If you do the math from the first, right, well, the second slide we saw tonight was 1260. That would be the year that the church was completed, minus the later tower on the left, and opened to the public. So these were being carved, these sculptures, just a few years, and were finished just a few years before the church opened. Okay, formal analysis. Well, actually, there is one more fact about the meaning, and it's the style of them. Gothic sculpture, yeah, it's actually an important fact, is almost always stiff and formal. And I would even go as far as to call it lifeless, or very, just you can say very little of any emotion. Let's do a close-up and you'll see what I mean. Look at the expressions. There's really no emotion, no normal human, kind of feeling that is, or expression of emotions that is obvious here. And if it isn't obvious, look at this. Again, we already did this close-up. This is obviously a mother and child that have a great affection for each other, and it shows in their expressions. Here, there's none of that. And that statue was also, well, just do one more. I should have done this while we're still on it. You see, is she standing with her weight on one hip? That's why it's almost like a remarkable mystery of history here. How did this sculptor know about this? Because maybe they guessed how well they could have gone and seen ancient Greek sculptures. No museums were open then, so I'm not sure where this sculptor could have seen that. But it's almost in contrapposto, isn't it? And that means it's lifelike, natural, and it therefore is not stiff, formal, and unemotional. These are stiff and formal, and that's typical. The point is about the meaning here of Gothic sculpture, that they tended to almost all be very unlifelike. I don't know if I'd go that far, but just say they don't have very much emotion, or very little, if any, emotion. And they are very kind of formal, stiff and formal. That's the best way to put it. And that's just the style of Gothic sculpture, even though Romanesque came earlier and was the previous medieval style, and it was more lively. Remember, they always were in motion, the main figures shown in moving poses in mid-movement, and they had emotions on their faces and in their body language. Not Gothic sculpture. It rarely did, with the exceptions, a few exceptions like we just saw. Okay, so that's plenty on the meaning. Do a formal analysis. These are cool gray, even though the walls of the church, remember, have a warm yellow stone. We talked about that. The sculpture is the cool gray color stone, so there's no warm colors here. And then we have the fact I just said, that they are very stiff and formal. Of course, they're jam statues, so to some degree that's inevitable. But remember, we saw a jam statue of the prophet Jeremiah, if you recall, from I think it was the last slide we saw last week, of Romanesque sculpture. And those, that guy was in motion. He was moving, and his body had was giving away some emotional content. These are not. So these are totally, there's nothing dynamic except the halos in the very, very top of their heads. Okay, and then we do have, though, good simulated textures, and that's obvious on the carved lines. It's all done with carved line. There's no painted line here on the robes, and on their faces, and their beards, their hair. It's true for all of these figures. There's, of course, other prophets and ancestors, other biblical figures, and again, on the other door jambs. The dual meaning of all the sculptures, also remember that they also represent our kings and queens. Okay, then we have the masses. Well, they're almost the same, aren't they? There's really not much difference, if any, in the height of these figures. And they're all about the same width, because they have to fit into the narrow space along the columns. So there's no larger or smaller masses here. They're all equal. Therefore, this is, if you take this as a single composition of these figures, I'm sure they were all, well, probably all designed by the same sculptor or created by the same sculptor. They're balanced, two on this side, two on that side, and the same height. So the only technique for space is overlapping, but it is real space. They're about 6 feet tall, which is slightly taller than life size back then. Most people were more like 5.5 feet, especially women. But in this case, you can just say slightly larger than life, and roughly 6 feet. Real space here, and obviously overlapping with clothes over their bodies, and their bodies against overlapping the columns. Then the modeling is the shadows from the sun. And I already said there's no, yeah, textures. I think we've covered everything. Space modeling. Let's see. Am I forgetting something? I think that's it. Yeah. Balance. Okay. So let's move on to the next muscle. Give me a second here. My throat gets a little scratchy these at the end of 2 back-to-back Zoom lectures. Okay, now I think this might be, did I take it off the list? If I did, you guys are getting a break. Well, let me look in next week because I might have just put it on next week's list. Yeah, I cut it to keep this little less lengthy for your note taking. So I'll just show you. You don't have to write this. We're going to do at least, what is it, 2 or 3 more must-haves. All right. So you don't have to write this, but this is a vaulted ceiling. We already talked about what that means. So again, just listen for a few minutes here. This is one of the tallest naves in the world. It's about 170 feet tall. And it's in a church, a Gothic church, of course, in France. You don't have to know where, but if you're curious, it's a town called Amiens, which is near the border with Germany. Amiens is the name of the town. And this is a remarkable nave for 2 reasons. One, the height of it, that alone would make it remarkable. You see the Gothic going vaulting up there, right? And that means you could fit a 17-story skyscraper inside this building. It would barely touch the ceiling. But then it's also unique in that there's almost no stained glass windows. And there is no real explanation for that anyone knows. Well, there's probably some historical record why they didn't either have the money or the talented labor, the skill, I should say, skilled labor, of the artists to create. Because, of course, stained glass windows take very specialized skills to create. So there isn't really any explanation for that. All we know is that it makes it lighter, much more light and open feeling when you're inside this church than any other Gothic church or cathedral, anyway, at least of the same period, because there's almost no color on the glass. It's just pure clear glass. And you can see that when you go, here's the Gothic Dorian vaulting on, these are the side aisles, and that would be the altar, of course, and that's the end of the nave. And there's the ambulatory, the walkway that would stretch around behind it, of course, like we saw on the first slide tonight. But let's take a look at, if it were to be on the must-know list, it would be this view that you would have, but now it's not on the sofa. So you just looking up from the floor. Actually, when I was in this church, I did just that because I'd already been teaching this course and saw this slide. It's not my own slide, it's from Slide Library. Look at that ceiling. That's a massively heavy ceiling. And again, the concept, if it's not been clear by now, this should really clinch that concept for you, hopefully, is what Gothic architecture is. It's actually, I didn't say this and I should have, it's a revolution in architecture or engineering, even a revolution in engineering, because that is literally, oh, this has got to be 80, maybe even more than 80% walls of glass. Look how narrow and minimal the stonework is lining each, every, what, 5th or 6th window. And then it's massive, heavy, obviously very weighty Gothic growing vaulted ceiling, and the towers, it's got 2 towers, tall tapering towers. All that weight is pressing down, and the flying buttresses carry the weight because it goes down to the edge where the buttress is attached to the walls, and the buttress, of course, from the outside goes, as you saw with Notre Dame, the weight of the building, that the buttresses deflect is a good word for it, away from the walls and down into the ground, allow for that very heavy ceiling and towers above it, and then these walls of windows. And of course, here, as you can see, I think there's only one stained glass window here, just the one at the back. For whatever reason, they must have been not as wealthy a diocese. The bishops have, right, different regions that they are the head of, and within the Catholic Church it's still the case. The bishops are usually in the biggest cities in that region, and that's usually where the cathedrals are, right? So this bishop, this diocese rather, must not have had as many, people available to work. Maybe it was the Black Plague or some other kind of disease or war. I don't know the reasons, or you just didn't have enough money. So they built the church to the specifications of that bishop, but they never were able to finish all the stained glass windows. So there's your walls of windows and Gothic growing vaulting, which you've already seen before. Okay, now this next must know is, it's on your syllabus, rose window. You can say at or in, doesn't matter which. Rose window in Notre Dame. N-O-T, remember it's the same as the interior of the church we saw before the break. N-O-T-R-E, second word dame or dame. In English, most people pronounce that word dame. D-A-M-E. Paris, of course, and the date, the little c, we don't know the exact year the stained glass was finished, but probably by the time the church opened, which was 1250. So we use that date. You can ignore, remember, you can ignore the little c, the little letters in front of any date that's on this syllabus. You should ignore them if you don't want to have to write. So probably finished when the church opened in 1250. So here we have the facts about it again. It's one of the two largest rose windows in the world. It's immense. And it's 40 feet across. To give you perspective, that is way wider than any other stained glass windows. The next closest are like 30, 33 maybe feet. There are two of them. This is one of them. I'm showing you this one because these are my own slides. So I think this came out as well, if not better than the other views, which I'll show you just for your own information. But if it's on the exam, again, this will be the view that we'll use and that you'll have to write about. So why is it called rose window? I mentioned before, but I didn't say you really need to write, but on this slide, the meaning, of course, is an important part of it. Why they call these large round rose windows, is because they're supposed to evoke the image of a giant rose blossom or blossoming rose, if I put it that way. And the stonework is supposed to represent the petals opening up. And of course, if it's not obvious, what looks black here, the dark section is solid stone, and the other lines are lead. Stained glass windows always are panels, painted panels, set into lead. And then, of course, those are set in between the stonework, the framing of the window. It's a very complex process. This is why if these had been damaged, let alone destroyed by the fire, they would have been very difficult, if not impossible, to replace. Maybe just plain glass. I mean, eventually they could have perhaps, but it would have taken, these windows took many years, even decades to complete. Maybe not 40 or 50 years, but like 10, possibly more, because each panel had to be hand painted by different artists and then put in place very slowly and very carefully. So they are remarkable creations and works of art. So what are the scenes that are on these windows? Well, now let's go ahead to a close-up and you'll get some idea. They're, of course, holy figures, from the Bible. And if it's not obvious, this is Mary, again, with baby Jesus on her lap. And that's what the church is named for. It's an important detail. Notre Dame means Our Lady, and that means Mary, Mother of Jesus. That's a French phrase for that whole concept. And there's lots of Notre Dames all over Europe, not just in France. And there's even several there's even a university that's famous for football or something. I think it is, maybe soccer, in Indiana, where not far from where my grandparents lived, called Notre Dame. And there's a church there that's a copy of this church, right? So it's a very common phrase used for Catholic churches all over the Western world. Okay, so these scenes on the outer sections, like the petals of the rose, are also hand-painted figures from the Bible. And they could be from either the Old Testament or the New Testament. And they would have been recognized by at least many, if not most, of the worshipers. But it's the colors I want to emphasize. Look at those deep, rich. I said this phrase with Sharp because you didn't see a close-up of those windows, but now that you're looking at this close-up, look at the deep, rich, saturated colors that are very, very evident in each of these hand-painted panels of glass. And you can see why they took so long to make. And then I think I have another view. Yeah, this is the purple rose window. I like this one a lot, but the other view is slightly better focused. Of the other, there are two, remember, rose windows. Well, there's three, one on the front that's smaller, and the two biggest are on the two side. Those are called transepts. It's not a word you'll have to use to get an A on the final, but it's useful to know. T-R-A-N SEPT, one word. That means the crossing, the section that crosses at a right angle to the nave, where on either end you have these gigantic rose windows at Notre Dame. Then I have another close up here. I love this one. I don't know if anyone here has ever seen Monty Python movies with cartoons, or even some of their old shows. They used to broadcast them. This looks like something from one of those comedy routines about the Middle Ages, where they actually create silly monsters coming up over the horizon. Now, this is a peasant, obviously, cutting wheat, and look at his face. It's no accident. He's not happy. This is not the life that, of course, anyone would choose. He was a slave. These were, European white slaves, whatever, of course, enslaved by other Europeans, the nobility. They had no rights. They were literally tied to the land. They may not have been kept in chains, but if they tried to run away, they would be, if they got caught, of course. And so it was a horrible life. And somehow the painter of this, either he had been or knows people were, maybe family members who were peasants. They were called serfs, S-E-R-F-S. So they're often scenes from everyday life in some of the stained glass. Here again are those deep, rich, saturated colors, the particularly popular, most popular colors in stained glass, not just rose windows, but any stained glass windows in the Middle Ages were reds and blues. Most popular colors. You can see how deep and rich they get. And then this is, the word is chicken-footed lion. I have no idea. It has to be something from the Bible, probably. Some kind of mythical creature that's half lion and half chicken. But here, this is a realistic image of a peasant hard at work, toiling away his life for some rich noble, and he's never going to be free of that. So you could say they're showing empathy, the artist of this particular panel, at least, if not all of the panels by any means. Even in a Catholic church, which you may know, the Catholic Church supported the nobility. I think I mentioned that. That's why some of the churches in France were damaged and still show the damage from vandalism, really, from mobs attacking the churches during the French Revolution, because they had the church officials, the higher ups at least, had sided with nobility. Okay, so the last thing we'll say about this is that this survived the fire, and now as part of the meaning of this one, and these could easily have collapsed, because lead melts at much lower temperatures than other metals, but somehow they survived. They didn't even buckle. They weren't damaged at all in that fire 3 years ago, so they were able to save them, and they don't have to restore them. Okay, formal analysis. Well, it's completely symmetrical, as would be any image of a perfect rose blossom, right? Full of the rhythm of the stone framing, of course, which would be like the petals, and the both round and rectangular panels, hand-painted stained glass panels. And the whole thing is dynamic. I don't really see anything stable, either on the framing, the shape of the window, or the panels themselves, because there's edges here. Maybe you could say that part is stable. But on each of these little painted scenes that we've seen, the figures are mostly dynamic too. So it's almost entirely dynamic. The colors are a mixture, of course, of warm and cool, warm reds and yellows and golds, and cool blues and whites and greens. The semi-texture is very much a part of a stained glass window, where the painting, the scenes of the human figures or the holy figures and the human figures have similar textures on their clothing and their face and their hair. But there is very little modeling on the, didn't mean to do that, on the panels. The only modeling really is from the sun that comes through, of course, depending on time of day, at different amounts. But you don't really see shadows here, except for the silhouetted lines of stonework. So you could say that the only modeling effect is the outlining or silhouetting, if you want to write it that way, of the stone framing created by the sunlight coming through the window. It's one large mass. I wouldn't really break it down. Just a single large one. This isn't part of what you'd have to be concerned about. These smaller pointed arch windows below the rose window. Just this one. The rhythm is obvious. Repeated shapes here, everywhere. The framing and the panels. The textures I already mentioned. Oh yeah, there is besides semi-texture on the painted scenes, there is the real smooth texture of the glass and real rough texture of the stone. The largest mass, I think it's a single mass. I think you'd have to just leave it at that. And already for space, you have two things. You have the real dimensions, 40 feet across, and the diameter is the right word, in every direction, total diameter is 40 feet, the real space. And then there's the, of course, techniques for space. There's really only overlapping on the figures. Their clothing overlaps their bodies, and some of the figures overlap each other on the painted panels. Okay, give me another second here. We'll get to the next list now. Okay, now I've said before the break, and I'll say it again because I don't know if everybody was here at the beginning, and those of you who signed in late or logged in late, that I am going to cut at least, say, 2 anyway, maybe more, of the cathedrals between last week's lecture and this week, because I know they start to look similar to each other. But you will then, when we do the review, which will be a week from tonight. No, it's, yeah, that's right. It's a week from tonight, because the test is 2 weeks from tonight, the final. Then you'll know, of course, that there'll still be several, in other words, the cathedrals left. So this one, I know it's very similar to Notre Dame. That should be obvious. Back, you see the exterior of Notre Dame, right, with the towers. I know, but this view should be obviously different enough because it's such a close-up view, and the color of the stonework is that off-white. Whereas this one is the warm yellow stone that we saw at chart. So this is our next must know. It's Reims, or if you're in France, you almost feel like you're wrecking your throat to pronounce it the way the French pronounce the name of the city, R-E-I-M-S. Reims, most people in America would say Reims Cathedral, 2 words. Location is France, and the date is 1428. So this is late Gothic, and here's the first of the terms. There's only a few more definitions or terms to know that you need to write down before the final. Again, any of which, until we do the review and reduce that list, like we did before, the same thing we did before the midterm, might appear on the true-false section of the final. This is called flamboyant style. So let me give you that definition before we talk about the meaning of this. Flamboyant style, it's a style of late Gothic architecture in France. Okay, a style of late Gothic architecture in France, comma, which uses flame-like decorations along the exterior, which uses flame-like decorations, plural, of course, along the exterior. Well, that's what you would see if you got up close here. So let's do a closer view. You see where my cursor is. Those are pieces of stone carved, of course, decorative stonework. That's supposed to look like flames licking up the side of this, pointed arch here. And the same on the other 3. So remember, the 3 portals is part of the meaning of any Gothic or Catholic church, for that matter, cathedral or regular church. The 3 portals we already covered, the 3 holiest figures. I don't have to repeat that, right? In the Catholic Church. So in that area of the church, there is a carved stonework or decorations done in stone that are supposed to symbolize flames licking up the sides of those pointed arches above the doors. And then the same, though less obvious, is at the top of the towers. It's supposed to represent a little hints of flames licking up to, or at the top, I should say, rather, along the top of the 2 towers. Why would they do that? Why would they need me to repeat that definition? No, the flamboyant. Okay, because that would be useful on either this slide or possibly the true-false section of the final. Okay, so why would they do that? Well, it's symbolic of the passion. It was meant to symbolize the flamboyant style, the passion, and, or you could say fervor, if you prefer that, or the devout religious beliefs that the people of this era had. We're talking about in the 1400s, a pretty awful time. It was even worse than what earlier medieval periods were, because if it's not obvious. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Because in the Inquisition, or how?
Well, the Inquisition comes a little bit later. That got pretty bad too. Yeah, but the next century, when the Protestants broke away from Catholic Church, the Catholic Church responded with the Inquisition. So it's a good point that, when you get just a little later, just a few decades after this, you had an Inquisition, but not this early. What it would have been a series of extremely difficult calamities, you could say, or challenges, horrible events. I'll give you just three examples as part of the meaning of this. This church was built during the 100 Years' War. 100 Years' War, yep, the continuous war of a century. Can you imagine that? Of course, would have been a terrible experience. Guess who fought the wars? Of course, the peasants, their sons and fathers and brothers, all the male family members of fighting age had to go off and fight the English. It was a war between England and France. It lasted 100 years. So that's one, tragedy, you could say, of daily life that affected people's daily life. Another was the Black Plague, or just say, it wasn't only the Black Plague. I shouldn't be that specific. It was a series of plagues, including the Black Plague, which total, and the Black Plague is the one that usually used this figure to describe how bad was it. 1 out of every 3 people in Europe died in that, the worst of all the plagues. But plagues happened every couple of decades. Or every 10 years, 20 years or so. You'd rarely go more than 20 years at most between plagues. So if average person lived maybe 60 years, if they were lucky, he might have lived through 3 plagues in your lifetime and watched, a huge portion of the people you knew die around you, and maybe got sick and almost died. So you had these series of plagues. That's the second great tragedy. And then the third would be, of course, the whole poverty I already indicated with the, stained glass painting of that peasant chopping wheat, how rough life was. But it got even worse because the noble classes got even more, if you can believe it, more oppressive. They were resisting the effort to get out of, there were peasant revolts, in other words, and those revolts were crushed brutally by the ruling class. So there were a series of peasant revolts in the 1400s, which were just totally smashed, and lots of people died, including, innocent people were arrested. If you knew someone who had rebelled and even you stayed obedient to your master could order your whole family killed. So there was a lot of rebellions, and they were almost all bloody and were totally defeated by the ruling classes in their crushing each one of these. So you had all these tragic events occurring, and in general, life was already, even before those events in the previous century, the 1300s. So during the late Middle Ages, from the mid 1300s on, that's when these problems began. The 100 Years' War started then, and the Black Death was about that, up through the mid 1400s. So we can just say for about the last 150 years of the Gothic era. In France, in particular, there was a lot of suffering, to say suffering on a huge scale, never known before, with all these long wars and the rebellions and the plagues. So people had to turn to religion, is the bottom line. That's what these churches in this so-called flamboyant style were meant to represent. By the way, the word flamboyant is French for flame-like. Literally, the word translates to flame-like. So they were trying to, the architects of these churches, who were the bishops, or maybe by now they occasionally might have a few actual trained architects, but in any case, the designers of each of these churches were trying to inspire, at least, or give a little hope, you could say, to the masses, to the peasants who were suffering so much, that, life now on this earth, this life, your current life, however you want to word that, may not be very pleasant, but if you pray and you follow the teaching of the church, you'll get to go to a better place, heaven. And of course, that's why they tried to get, or how, I should say, not why, but how they got so many people to come into these churches and be, faithful Catholics in the church, services. Almost everybody from the towns would go to these churches, and they would very much think that way. In other words, I need to be religiously faithful and even devout or passionate about my beliefs in Christian religion, because that's my only hope. It's a better life after this one if I follow the teachings of the Catholic Church and the Bible. So that's what the flames are meant to symbolize: the passion, religious passion or fervor of the masses who would worship in these churches. Now, a couple other facts about it. See this, the pavement here? I've been here. This church is really amazing. And I'll tell you, there's another thing about it that you can't tell from the outside. But underneath the streets here, underneath the cobblestone streets, are the first champagne caves. The drink that so many people like, champagne, in other words, was invented in this town, but not that far back. It was invented 400 years ago. So you could just say later on in the 1600s, want to be more specific, champagne was invented here. And this is the region of France where champagne was born. It was discovered, you could say, or created in caves. They call them champagne caves underneath the streets of Reims, the city of Reims. And then one other fact is that this church was very badly damaged in World War II by bombing and fighting in the streets when, British and American soldiers, you can just say Allied soldiers, liberated France from the Nazis. In this case, unlike Putin's lies, that's actually what we were doing, right? Chasing the Germans back into Germany and forcing them to surrender. So during the last part of World War II, when there was heavy fighting here and bombing raids, this church, all the stained, almost not, I think about 3 or 4 didn't, but almost all the stained glass windows, including the rose windows, there are 3 of them, they were all quite large, were destroyed, as well as some of the outside of the church. So the church had to be repaired, or restored is a better word. And all the stained glass windows were replaced with modern stained glass. It's very jarring when you walk inside this Gothic masterpiece. It's one of the most beautiful Gothic churches in France, right? One of the most famous. It's also where all the kings of France were crowned, including when Joan of Arc, you've heard of her, I hope, one of the most amazing people in history. Joan of Arc helped this one incompetent noble become the next king. When she did all the fighting, she was the one that led their armies that was in the 100 Years' War against the English. She won a few victories for them that they couldn't win for themselves. She chose the next noble person to become the next king, and she helped crown him in this church. So many of the earlier kings, the late medieval era of kings of France, were crowned inside this church. In fact, all of them for hundreds of years. So that's another fact about the meeting. Anyway, the windows have been replaced. The last fact on the meeting is they were replaced by a modern, relatively modern 20th century, late 20th century painter named Marc Chagall. Well, if you take art 2.3, or even 2.2, I think that they cover that. He was a French Jew who left, luckily, when Hitler invaded. He got out and he came back after the war to paint windows on mosques, synagogues, and churches. He was Jewish, but he wasn't, limiting his creativity to Jewish houses of worship. So he was asked to paint these windows by the government of France, and they're very beautiful, but they don't look at all like any other stained glass windows in a Gothic church. They're very modern looking, and those windows are considered masterpieces, but they don't quite fit the period of the church. But that was what the French government asked him to do. He wasn't going to try and recreate the old stained glass. It was gone. Okay, so let's do the formal analysis. Is it totally symmetrical? Here, the 2 towers are the same width. If they look that way, it's because they really are. There's no game playing here with the bishop trying to make one of them, surreptitiously slightly larger or wider. They're the same height, the same width. These 2 towers here are about also about 240 feet tall. Maybe it's 250. It's close to 250. So say nearly or about 250 feet. That's for space. And then the nave here is about also about 130 feet. It's not quite as tall as the nave. Actually, that might look like the top of the nave. It's not. The nave is right here. So it's about 130 feet. And then we have the ceiling. Of course, we have the rhythm. Of course, the 2 towers are identical. The statues, the pointed arches on the doors and windows, the 3 doorways. Remember the triportals, that all is repeated shapes, and there it's all dynamic. Of course, the pointed arch doors and windows, the rose window. Here you can't see the flying buttresses very easily, but they're just the edges of them there, and that of course would create more rhythm. The color here is warm, as I was saying. It's a kind of a light yellow stone that is the same or very similar to the same color as Chartres Cathedral. And then we have the lines here are carved. You can't really see, and visual, I should say both. The carved lines would be around the doorways and on some of the statues. Well, you can see that there are statues here, right? So that's carved line. And then visual line is everywhere else, is true of all buildings, which is the corners or edges of the walls and doorways. And window frames, and that's all created. The visual line, of course, is created by the shadows, the natural modeling of the sun. There's no technique for modeling. The stained glass windows do have some cool colors, but you can't see them here, so you can just say it's basically a warm color. And then we have the textures, are the real texture of the rough stone and the real texture of rough wood. The doors are all wood. And then there's, oh, welcome. Hi, welcome back. Yeah, we're just on one of the last couple slides for tonight. This is Reims Cathedral. We're just doing the formal analysis. So again, the textures are the real rough texture of stone on the walls, the real rough texture of wood on the doors, and of course, the real smooth texture of glass on the windows. And then the largest mass, well, they're equal. These two towers are the two largest masses. And then some people consider these a separate mass because they project. You see the three doors, the tri-portals, the stonework projects from the wall. So if you count that as a separate mass, it's a close call if that's the second largest mass. And then the central section, the middle portion of the facade would be third probably. And it is definitely balanced, left to right, symmetrical left to right. And unbalanced is always the case with churches with two towers, with the empty space in between, of course, is unbalanced toward the bottom. Okay. Now, I cut this, I think I did. Well, let me see. This might be from next week's lecture. Hang on, I'm just looking ahead. Okay, let's see. Sainte-Chapelle. I cut that. Actually, you're getting a break on that, but I'm going to do one more must know because look at next week. We've got more slides to cover, and there's a variety of new definitions, our last new definitions. And I don't want to have to rush through it, or, I'm sure you guys don't mind that we're pretty consistently being able to end 10 or 15 minutes early, even more sometimes. So I'm going to go ahead and do one more slide from that's on next week's list, but it's part of the same topic. Of course, it's within the realm of Gothic architecture. I cut this off the list, but why don't you all, now let's do this together so there's no confusion. Take your pens out if you don't have a pen out, if you have one, and cross off Sainte-Chapelle. I'd love to show you that, but I don't have the slide here. It's on another, file, and let's just not go back and forth. And I was going to cut one anyway. I almost always do as we get toward the end of the semester. So you see, it's the last slide listed for week 14 from tonight's lecture, from the bottom, second from the bottom. Sainte-Chapelle, that's one of the more beautiful little, it's not a cathedral, small churches in Paris, but it's not on the, and it's not going to be on the final. And now please take your pen and cross it off the syllabus so you don't waste time studying and looking it up, unless you want to for extra credit for some reason, but that wouldn't really apply unless you go there, right? Or if you could watch a documentary, but I don't think there are any hour-long documentaries on that chapel. It's across the plaza, directly facing Notre Dame. It's very famous, but we won't cover it. So there we go. We got that. All right, and this is a slide that I put on our 2.1. We have more time on Gothic because we don't do world art. It covers the same eras, but it's more focused on just European art, but that's not on the syllabus, so you don't have to worry. See, these actually have emotion, and these are from Strasbourg Cathedral, one that we're not actually, well, we are going to cover. Let's do one more. Yeah, Gothic church. Here's what we'll do. Let's do this. This is Cologne Cathedral. I'll save Salisbury Cathedral for next week because there's a lot to say. Well, there is about both these next two. So you see where I know it says it's for week 15, next Monday, May 16th. But we also want to review. So it's a good idea not to, and look how early we are. So let's do this. Cologne Cathedral, Cologne, Cologne Cathedral. That's like the men's perfume, right? But it's a city in Germany, of course. The location is Germany, and the date is 1248. Okay, so let's do this. First of all, we know what makes something Gothic by now, right? But I'll briefly recap because I know not everybody was here at the start when I held up that diagram. It's got pointed arches, This is part of the meaning of all architecture is what style is it is, what makes it this style? Well, the pointed arch doors and windows. It's got the 3 doors here. And the flying buttresses, here they are. You can see the stone. They're much more ornate and wider, thicker, you could even say, than the ones in France, but they're the same exact feature. They support the weight of the roof above them. And then here, the ones along the side, right there, support these massive towers. So there's a lot to say about this church, but let's just start with the fact that it is Gothic style, and these are the reasons. Of course, the tall, tapering spires, you see them. Now, the rose window here isn't that large, and it's really incorporated into another window, but it's there. It's around, and on the 2 transepts, the 2 side aisles, or cross sections, so you could say side aisles, I guess, but transepts is the right word. Those also have each one on each end rose windows. So there's, like all Gothic cathedrals, 3 rose windows. And inside you'd see the Gothic groin vaulting, right? So it has a classic feature that mark all Gothic style churches. But there's several things unique about this. These towers are over 500 feet tall. 500 feet tall. And they are not part of what was in the church when it opened. And I think I gave you guys the date. Yeah, 1248. When the church was completed and opened, it was incomplete. I should say when the church opened to the public, sufficiently completed to have its services, inside. The towers were not completed. You see where this cursor is? That's where the base of the towers would have been, and nothing was above them. They sat for centuries, uncompleted, these 2 towers. Here we know why. Again, this is that period of upheaval in Germany, though it began even earlier, poverty and wars and plagues. And so they just didn't have the manpower or the money to complete these 2 towers. Part of the original design, we actually still have, the church owns the blueprints from the Middle Ages, the original drawings. And they wouldn't be blue like a modern blueprint is, which is printed right off of a camera image. It's not that kind of blue, of course, hand drawn black and white on parchment, right? But they have them. They know the towers were originally planned to be there, but they just didn't have the money to finish them. So what did happen? How did these massive towers over 500 feet get completed? By a man named Bismarck, and there's no other way to say this. He was the first ruler of unified Germany. Even though he didn't hold the office of president or chancellor or any of that, he was the man that unified Germany. You may have heard of him. If not, just write his name with the capital B, of course. Bismarck, Bismarck. He was the man who unified Germany, and he did it with his church. This church was how he unified Germany. Maybe you might say, how can a church? Well, he said, let's get together all these little warring kingdoms. Remember, there was no Germany, right? If it needed to be unified, that tells you, but if you didn't know, you should say. But when this project started, Bismarck, who wanted to see Germany become a unified country, this cathedral was incomplete, and there was no complete country that today we think of as Germany. It was just a bunch of warring kingdoms, dozens of them fighting each other for centuries. So he said, let's stop that and let's come together and finish the towers of Cologne Cathedral as a symbolic gesture of unification. It was a brilliant PR move. Really, that's what it was. I wouldn't use that word back then, but it was with public relations. And it wasn't a stunt. It was for real. Little school kids, teachers, peasants, factory workers, professors, families from all over Germany gave money, or actually some of them spent their vacations coming here to help finish these 2 towers. And they did it in amazing record time. They finished the 2 towers, and they began in 1848 and they finished by 1870. It's 22 years. So just a little over 20 years, keep it simple. The entire upper half of these 2 towers was completed in just over 20, to be exact. 22 years, that's remarkable. Remember, they didn't have the high-tech equipment we have today for construction. And it was done because Bismarck came up with this brilliant plan to help get people thinking as a country, a unified nation. And sure enough, when the towers were completed, all these kingdoms voted to join each other and govern and create their own new government, the first parliament of Germany. It was literally more than symbolic. It was an actual process by which Germany became unified in effort to complete these towers. It's a pretty remarkable event. Now, there's a couple other things about it that are unique. It is the largest Gothic style building in the world. Now, anybody from Italy? No, right? In my classes yet? If you're from Italy, I know I have friends there, they'll argue with you. They say, no, Milano, the Cathedral of Milan, northern Italy, it is huge. And it is the largest cathedral in terms of its interior space. But the building, the mass, the weight, the total weight is much bigger here. So again, I'll say that you can just keep it simple, that this is the largest Gothic building in the world of any kind, whether it's, Gothic architecture, I didn't say this, probably should have, isn't only used on churches. That's how it starts, and it was created for that purpose. But Gothic architecture was used on, castles, fortresses, town halls all over Europe in the Middle Ages. It became popular for all kinds of public buildings. Okay, so this is the largest Gothic building in the world with, I think it is the third, these towers are the third tallest church towers in the world. And then the final thing is, you might see if anybody, again, it's just educated guessing here, but you guys have been doing pretty good with that tonight. You notice that around it, this is it's the third largest city in Germany. It's like, well over 1 million people, Cologne. And it was a big factory town. And during World War II, it got bombed into rubble. The entire city, or at least the old center of Cologne. Look at these buildings. These are not medieval buildings, right? The town was medieval. In fact, it was founded by the Romans. Cologne was actually a Roman capital of the province of Germany when the Roman Empire conquered what's now most of Western Germany was under Roman rule. So there are Roman ruins there, and then there was all these Gothic churches. Every other, 1 or 2 churches also survived. But can anybody guess why the American and British bombers chose deliberately, not the bombers, but their commanders, just say the Allied commanders, there we go. Allied commanders during World War II deliberately spared this church. I'll give you a clue. The church spires can be seen from 75 miles away on a clear day. And Germany was bombed every day during that part of the war, when we were sending bombers over for years, to get them to, of course, surrender and reduce their ability to fight, the war. Anybody guess why would Allied commanders decide to leave these 2 unusually tall church spires standing during a war with bombing raids passing over this city every
I
day?
remember you mentioned as a landmark or something.
Yes, excellent. You got everybody hear that? Yes, they used the towers as a landmark to guide their bombing raiders, so that any crew of a plane flying towards Germany over France, right? First, they'd cross over France from England where they were based, and then they'd see these towers on a clear day at least. There's no mountains, in other words, it's all flat around this part of Germany. There's no mountains. So they would know that's the Rhine River, that's the city of Cologne. Now we go, left or right, or keep going straight towards our target, right? So they left them standing to use them as a landmark for their bombing raids. It's kind of ironic. It had nothing to do with what some people might have guessed. Perhaps, they were just being nice, and that they decided the church was so, well, it is. It's a beautiful building. So historic and valuable, a piece of heritage, that they wouldn't destroy it. No, they bombed the daylights out of churches all over Germany, including Berlin. There weren't any churches still standing in Berlin by the end of World War II. None. They left a couple of them. If you ever go to Berlin, you see the ruins of them just sitting the way they looked at the end of the war. It's a reminder that let's not go down that path again, right? That wasn't a good chapter in the history of Germany. So this is nothing to do with politics or history or preservation. It had to do with military tactics. Yes, you said it right. It was used as a landmark for the bombing raids. Okay, that's plenty on the meaning of this. Let's do our formal analysis, and then I'm going to do this. It will benefit all of us next week. I'm going to do one more slide. I'll pick the shortest one, and then next week, that way we won't A, have to rush, and B, have more time for a review, because we're still going to end early. We're going to end about 9:15. So let's go ahead and do the formal analysis in one more slide, and then we'll call it a night, and I'll stick around for any questions. All right, it's completely symmetrical. Almost all Gothic churches are, especially if they have identical or twin towers. They do. And the 2 towers, the space is 515 feet. Isn't that amazing? Like a 50-story skyscraper. And then the nave is about 170, I think it's 168. So nearly 170 feet tall, the ceiling inside. So that's the space. The color is actually a cool gray color. This slide makes it hard to tell. It's not a black and white slide. It's just slightly, undercolored. No, the coloration of it isn't great. It's the best slide I could find that showed the whole building. So just say that it's a cool gray color. It looks almost black here. And when I've seen this church 3 times, I've been to Cologne, always it's covered in soot. This is still a factory region, industrial pollution all the time. And so the stonework is constantly covered in smoke and soot. So it makes it look neutral or black, but it's actually a cool gray color. And of course, the texture is the real rough texture of stone and the real smooth texture of glass in the windows. And then the real smooth texture of metal. That's actually metal on the roofs here. I forget what kind of metal. And then we have the largest masses, pretty easy. That would be the 2 towers and then the nave. And now you kind of need to use that third term that describes the third segment you can see from this view. The transept, TRANSEPT, that part is the 3rd largest mass. The nave is always longer than the crossing part of transept. So that's the 3 largest masses. The modeling is just the shadows from the sun. The lines here almost all visual because you can't really see carved lines that easily, although there are obviously in the carved decorations around the doors, but the view you'll have will be just the whole thing. So you can't really see that. So you can just say most of the lines you can see here are visual, or you could say there's some carved lines around the doors and windows. And of course, I already said the modeling is just the shadows from the sun that creates those visual lines. Let's see, balanced, totally symmetrical left to right, and of course unbalanced toward the bottom. And it's stable on the outer walls or corners of the building, and dynamic on all the doors and windows and the 2 towers and the roofs, of course. And let's see, the rhythm is obvious, the repeated shapes of the spires, the imported arch doors and windows. And yeah. That's it. You can't really see the flying buttresses, but that would create rhythm as well. Okay, let me think about this. What would be the best way to do this? Because next week, hang on, let me take 30 seconds here. I'm going to go back and just see if that's. Oh, I cut this off. Oh, that's good. So that'll be one less thing. Let's go ahead and do the one more cathedral. Okay, that'll take us up to about 9:15, about when I was intending to stop, at least close to 15 minutes early. Okay, so this is, and it's on the page you're still on. So it's the other slide from the first part of week 15. Salisbury Cathedral. Yes, it's spelled the same as the stake, which is where the stake got its name, a town in England. Salisbury, Salisbury, Cathedral. Location again, England, and the date is 1330. So this will be our last slide of the cathedral. And like I said, I'll figure out which ones to cut when we do the review next week. So this is a style, and only one more new definition after this next week. Well, actually, it's 2 more definitions. So it's the second one down from the list of 5 features of Gothic churches. You already have the flamboyant style. So here we go. This is one other definition for tonight's lecture, and it's decorated style. That is a style of late Gothic architecture in England, comma, a style of late Gothic architecture in England, comma, with ornately carved stone decorations along the exterior, or exteriors, I should say. I'll say it again, with ornately carved stone decorations along the exteriors. This church is a classic example of that style, but not the whole building, just the tower. You can see what I mean if you follow the cursor here. These walls are pretty plain. It's just the windows and then the plain flat stonework. So that's not the decorated style, as you may be able to tell. The church took over 100 years to build, by the way. So by the time they finished it, it was this new period in English Gothic architecture, the last period of English Gothic style churches was called the decorated style. And you can see it all the way up the tower. Look at it. Even on the spire, you get some of it. Well, here, let's do this. Yeah, you see that carved decorations along the exterior in between the windows above and below them. So the decorated style applies in this church only to the tower, whereas any church built, after the style started, the whole building would be that style. So it's only example that's all you're going to see. And again, it's part of what a couple of you mentioned accurately observed about that tower that was the later tower on Chartres Cathedral for the break, that the one that's more ornate, more decorated is the later one. And that was a rule, as I told you, it's just human nature. I guess people like to get more decorative and more, ornate, more detailed, the later a given work of art to a painting, sculpture, and architecture, but especially in architecture. The later it is, the more ornate it is. And then eventually there's a reaction against that and things become plain and simple again, and then it starts all over. But within each period, and this is within the Gothic, it's late Gothic. Does anybody need me to repeat that definition? English decorated style. All right, so what's unique about this church? There are 5 things. This building, I've been here twice, and both times it's just a pleasure to go here. First of all, it's the tallest tower, church tower, I should say, tallest church tower in the British Isles. That's not just England, remember, England's just part of the British Isles. You got Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. So just keeping it simple, it's the tallest church tower in the British Isles. It's 405 feet. Another fact about it, based on that fact, is that it has the first airplane warning light in the British Isles. It's actually here, right there. It blinks red every few seconds. I think it's like every 5 seconds. It's been there for, actually, I think it's 100 years this year. It is from the early 1920s, if you want to write that. But you just could just keep it simple and say that it has the first or earliest airplane warning light in the British Isles. Well, if you think about it, there were no other buildings. There were no skyscrapers in London. Now there are a whole bunch of them, over 1,000 feet even. I think it's tragic. I hate that. I love London, but modern American-looking skyscrapers don't belong there. But anyway, there are a bunch of them now if you see movies filmed in London. But there weren't when this was built. This was the tallest structure on the British Isles. So airplanes, yeah, they were beginning to fly back and forth in the 20s, carrying passengers and mail. And of course, it gets foggy, as you may or may not know, in southern England a lot. And so these planes could have crashed into this tower. None has ever done that because they have this warning light, the first one in the British Isles. Another unique fact about it is it has a double transept. I told you what transepts are, and I said it would be a good word to use. And if I'm not saying it will be, if it isn't cut from the study list and it's on the final, you'd probably want to use that term for these 2 sections that cross the nave. That would be the nave. It goes all the way past where you can see it here out towards the far end. And so of the 2 sections or transepts that cross, they're flanking the tower. They're very carefully placed. They help support the weight of that massive tower, along with the flying buttresses. See, these flying buttresses are not very prominent, are they? They don't support as much weight as the ones in France at Chartres and Reims and Notre Dame. They help, but the main reason the tower, massive, you can imagine how heavy the tower would be, as thick and as tall, would be because of the 2 transepts. So again, I'll repeat that in one phrase, that this is unique. In another way, this church is unique, is that it has a double transept. There are a few other churches in the British Isles that have that, but this is one of the few. And then it's got the original wall, stone wall, handmade, I should say, medieval wall. Stone, of course, handmade stone medieval wall around the entire yard. But the Brits like to say close. You can write it either way. The phrase close in British lingo is the space enclosed around a church with a wall. So that's the original medieval wall, which was finished about the time the church was, and it's totally intact. I mean, not a section missing. It's remarkable that it survived all that and didn't get knocked down and the property sold off for condos, right? Like many other churches throughout the world, not just in England or Europe, because the land is very valuable. By the way, you could add this, you don't have to, but Salisbury is a tourist haven. It's got this cathedral, it's got Stonehenge just outside town. It's an easy short drive. You can afford to pay for a taxi ride there if you wanted to from the town. And the town itself is just gorgeous. It's a medieval town. Every single street in the old town is intact with buildings 500 to 1,000 years old. And they're all charming and beautifully maintained. Great little shops and pastries, bistros, and it's just a fantastic place to visit if you ever get to England, about 80 miles outside of London. Anyway, so you have the close, and it's remarkable. That is almost unique because almost every other city with a cathedral in England, some part of the yard has been subdivided, sold, or otherwise, altered. It's intact, the yard and the wall around it. And finally, maybe the most remarkable thing, it has the oldest working clock in the world. The oldest working clock on earth is in the nave, hanging from the top of the nave or near the top of the nave. It's been keeping time for nearly 700 years. It's never not kept time. It has to be rewound by hand. It's not a mechanical clock. It's done with ropes and pulleys. And the priests have to, do that, whatever it is they have to do to keep it running. It's about every 3 days. I talked to the priest that was there when I was there the last time, and he said, yeah, we got to reset it every 3 days or so, but we've never let it stop keeping time. So it's never run down. It's the oldest working clock on earth. And it's an old, with Roman numerals, big hand carved wooden numerals on the wall and ropes and pulleys, but it keeps time accurately for 7 centuries. Okay, that's plenty of facts. Oh, this church, you could say, is also the most popular church for painters when they come to England, if they don't just paint London. If they go to rural England, outside London, small towns, this church is one of the most popular sites for painters for hundreds of years. It's been painted since the Renaissance, not just by painters from England, but painters from Germany, France, Holland will come to England and go to this church just to paint it because it's such a beautiful setting. I mean, it's unspoiled, right? All right, let's do our formal analysis. Then we'll wrap it up in right around 9:14 or so. So first of all, for space, I mentioned the tower, but I didn't talk about the other dimensions. So the real space is the tower is about 405 feet tall. The nave is barely 110 feet. The ceiling, it's nowhere near as tall as most naves and cathedrals in Europe. So those are the 2 dimensions of real space. And then we have the largest mass, pretty obvious. It is the tower. Then it would be the nave, which goes all the way, across the middle of the building. And then each transept, they're equal, of course, in size, would be the 3rd largest masses. It's balanced. Yes, it's symmetrical. If you stand here, the 2 transepts in the tower in the middle and the rest of the, either end of the nave, it's completely symmetrical left to right. Or if you enter the church, that's where the entrance is right about here. It would be completely balanced left to right and obviously unbalanced toward the bottom. The textures, the real rough texture of stone on the walls, the real smooth texture of glass on the windows, and the real smooth texture of metal on the roofs. That metal is probably later. Then we have, of course, the rhythm, right, of the pointed arched windows and all the doors, and then the decorations on the tower. They also form rhythm, of course. The decorated part of the stonework is repeated shapes. And those are all obviously dynamic, all the pointed arch doors and windows, but also the flying buttresses. And then these things are called finials. I think I've mentioned that word before. You don't have to know it or use it for the test, but if you want to get the right word, these sort of like small little versions of the towers, these miniature towers, if you want to call them that, they're just decorations. There's nothing functional. They're called finials, F-I-N-I-A-L. They are everywhere in every corner. Not all churches, Gothic churches, have them. So the finials create rhythm and they're dynamic, of course. The color, you can't tell from this picture. Again, it was the only view I could get that showed the whole thing, including the yard around it. And it was a good, clear shot photo. So I'll just say it's pink. It's pink. That's really, oh, I should have said that's the sixth thing that makes this church unique, but you don't have to add that now on the meaning. You've got enough facts. So just say in the formal elements, when it comes to color, it's warm. So warm pink stone, very unusual. And of course, then the stained glass has both warm and cool colors painted on it. The line here is painted on the windows and visual at the corners. And of course, it would be carved around the tops. Oh, well, on the tower, that's where it's most obvious, the decorated carved stone ornaments. So that's carved line and visual line and painted, all three. And let's see, I know I'm forgetting something. Line, I know I'm forgetting something. Modeling, oh yeah, the modeling is just the shadows created by the natural modeling is created by the shadows of the sun. I think that we've covered everything here, yeah. All right, so we got finished just a little before 9:15, early as I promised. But now is a good chance to ask questions about anything related to extra credit. Don't forget that I will send what you'll see them, I assume, in your inbox before the weekend, certainly before the end of this week, by probably sometime tomorrow night. The details of the walking tour, the optional extra credit event or opportunity, if you want to call it that, to attend, and I will ask people to RSVP by the end of next week. All the details, where we're meeting, and the time again is Sunday, May 22nd from 2 to 4:30 in Berkeley, and that's worth 20 points extra credit. And yes, you can invite a guest, a friend. Each student wants to, and of course, you do need to log in. I'll tell you that when we get to the, last week or next week, obviously before the tour. I have an assistant I pay, of course, to do all that paperwork. I can't be doing that and talking about the buildings. We're going to go inside 4 historic buildings that aren't open to the public. So hopefully that'll be interesting enough for some of you to make the trip to Berkeley. Okay, any questions now about anything relating to what we covered tonight, extra credit, late papers? I still have 4 or 5 people that haven't done their second paper. So hopefully see several of those, if not all of those that haven't yet turned your papers in. Hopefully before the weekend, because then they can get graded before the test, and I can give you the grades, send you the grades back by next week. If you turn them in later than that, the end of next week is the deadline, next Friday. They'll be accepted, 10 points off, right? But you probably won't get the grades back until after the exam. And so it isn't a good thing to go into a final in any class where you still have, a quarter of the total points unknown. And so you wouldn't know what's the number of points you need to achieve to, get by the end of the exam to achieve the grade you want. So in that case, you'd want to probably consider trying to max out your extra credit options, which no one's come close. Remember, it's 60 points is the total that each person can earn if they decide to take different total options. I mean, different kinds of options they total. Everyone is the same opportunity, 60 points maximum. No one's done more than 30 so far. All right, now is your chance to ask these. Again, as always, my informal office hours before we call tonight. And I guess maybe don't tell me what the score. I'm recording it, but if the Warriors are still playing, probably some of you are going to head off that way, or watch the recorded version. I keep telling my daughter, she looks at her phone constantly, and she'll say, "Oh, look at the score now," and I'll say, "Shh, don't tell me. I want to watch it after I finish my teaching or whatever else I have to do." So, anybody have any questions? Now's your chance about anything.
I do have a question. So we can still send the second paper, right, this week, because I'm one of those person. I cannot access my Gmail account, so I'm still waiting to.
Oh, you're having that problem? Oh God.
Yeah.
I've heard that from a lot of different people. I was accused of harassing the department secretary when I know she did, but I had no way of knowing, sent me 2 emails in a row telling me I didn't have to do any of the flex, they call them, activities that faculty have to do, sit and watch videos about things you already know, log in and then write something and prove you did.
But I just want to be sure that I can still.
The campus, what is your way? You don't mind my asking what your server is? Did you say Gmail? That's one I haven't heard about. Having that issue, I'm saying, but the campus website has. I'm just telling you.
I don't know, it's just my account. I don't know why, but
Your own account, not the.
yes, but I'm supposed to wait another 24 hours to.
Oh, well, thank you for telling me, but that's not gonna cost you any more points. You know that, right? I mean, it's not,
Okay.
it's better that you took the time. Are you saying you finished your paper and you just haven't had a chance to send it in? Is that what I hear you saying?
Yes, because I did it on the Google Docs, so I need to.
Then you know it's got to be converted to PDF. Well, thank you for telling me. And at this point, I would say just go ahead. Oh. Oh, yeah. Well, that usually works fine, but like I said, the campus, if anything, might be safer now because I just was telling you that I got this testy email from the dean saying, don't harass, I wasn't harassing her. She didn't answer my emails because I didn't think she did because they didn't show up in my inbox. And then we got this notice that there was a failure of several hours, several days in a row of the campus email system. But if you can just send that then, right? We were just talking, when by Wednesday, even Thursday, it'll get graded by the weekend. Or certainly over the weekend. And so I can get you the grade back before a Monday class. But I'll just commit to that because I'll have a bunch of late papers all at once. But
Thank
okay, it won't cost you any extra points. It's just 10 points off, doesn't go up. And it's better you take your time if you didn't already and do the best job you can. Then you can make up the missing points with extra credit. Right. All right. Okay, anybody else with any other questions or issues? Understandably, these tech things keep cropping up. It seems to be more of them in the last few weeks than there have been in the last couple of years. Since the original Naked Streakers appeared on the first Zoom class lectures. Luckily, I wasn't in Zoom system at that time, but I heard about it from other teachers. At least we haven't had that issue, right? Hopefully we won't. All right, last call. Anybody have any other questions? Nope. Okay, we'll see you guys next Wednesday.